Victor Langley was a man who lived in a world of his own making. He had built an empire from nothing, clawing his way to the top with sharp elbows and sharper words. His name was everywhere, on skyscrapers, luxury brands, and even charitable foundations that bore his initials but did little actual good. To the outside world, Victor was a self-made success story, a shining example of what hard work could achieve. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. Victor grew up in a wealthy family, but he didn't inherit his billions. Instead, he earned them through relentless ambition and cutthroat business tactics. By the age of 40, he owned companies in industries ranging from real estate to technology, amassing more money than he could ever spend. Yet for all his wealth, Victor remained deeply unhappy. His heart was cold, hardened by years of believing he was better than everyone else, and perhaps the saddest part was that he truly believed it. Victor hated anyone who wasn't like him. If you weren't white, rich, and powerful, then in Victor's eyes, you were worthless. Immigrants, lazy freeloaders stealing jobs from real Americans. Minorities, criminals or welfare cheats. Women, weak and overly emotional. These were the beliefs he carried with him every day, shaping how he treated others and how he saw the world. It wasn't just idle thoughts either. Victor acted on these prejudices. He refused to hire people of color at his companies unless absolutely necessary. He funded political campaigns aimed at keeping immigrants out of the country. He even paid off politicians to block affordable housing projects near his gated communities because he didn't want those kinds of people living close to him. His employees despised him, but no one dared speak out. They needed their jobs too much. At board meetings, executives tiptoed around him, afraid to disagree lest they lose their positions. Even his friends, though few in number, knew better than to challenge him. Those who tried were quickly cut out of his life. Victor surrounded himself only with yes men, people who told him what he wanted to hear rather than what he needed to hear. But as much as Victor thought he was untouchable, cracks began to show in his perfect facade. Publicly, he was still hailed as a genius businessman, but privately whispers about his cruelty spread far and wide. Journalists wrote exposés detailing how he crushed competitors without mercy, fired loyal workers without warning, and manipulated laws to avoid paying taxes. Social media buzzed with stories of former employees sharing horror tales about working under him. Protesters gathered outside his corporate headquarters, holding signs that read, "Victor Langley doesn't care about you." Still, none of this seemed to faze him. In fact, Victor thrived on the chaos. Controversy fueled his ego, making him feel even more invincible. Every attack against him only reinforced his belief that the world was full of jealous losers trying to bring him down. So when another scandal erupted, a minor one compared to some of the others, he dismissed it as just another hurdle to overcome. The incident happened during a high-profile gala hosted at his sprawling mansion overlooking the city skyline. The event was supposed to celebrate innovation and entrepreneurship, attended by celebrities, politicians, and business leaders alike. Victor loved hosting these parties because they gave him a chance to flaunt his wealth and influence. This time, however, things took a turn he hadn't anticipated. During a panel discussion featuring young entrepreneurs, a rising star named Marcus Johnson stepped onto the stage. Marcus was African American, barely 30 years old, and already running a successful tech startup that had garnered national attention. As he spoke passionately about breaking barriers and creating opportunities for marginalized communities, the audience listened intently, clapping enthusiastically after each point. But Victor sat stiffly in his seat, scowling. When it came time for questions, Victor grabbed the microphone before anyone else could. Leaning forward in his chair, he sneered at Marcus. "So tell me, Mr. Johnson," he began, his tone dripping with condescension. "How exactly does someone like you manage to succeed? I mean, most people in your situation don't have the drive or discipline to make it this far." The room went silent. Gasps rippled through the crowd as people realized what Victor had just said. Marcus blinked, taken aback by the insult disguised as a question. For a moment it looked like he might lash out, but instead he smiled calmly. "Someone like me? he replied, his voice steady. I guess someone like me succeeds by working twice as hard as everyone else and refusing to let people like you define my worth. The audience erupted into applause, many standing to cheer for Marcus. Cameras flashed wildly as reporters scrambled to capture the exchange. Victor, however, remained unmoved. He leaned back in his chair, smirking as if he'd won some sort of victory. What he didn't realize was that this moment, a seemingly small confrontation, would set off a chain reaction that would change his life forever. Over the next few days, footage of the incident went viral. News outlets played clips of Victor's comment over and over, dissecting his choice of words and labeling him everything from ignorant to outright racist. Social media exploded with hashtags calling for boycotts of his products and demanding accountability. Some critics called for his resignation from various boards and organizations. Others simply mocked him, creating memes that turned his smug expression into a symbol of privilege and prejudice. For once, Victor couldn't ignore the backlash. Calls flooded into his office, emails piled up in his inbox, and protesters gathered outside his properties. Even his closest allies started distancing themselves, fearing association with such a toxic figure. Still, Victor refused to apologize. Apologies were for the weak, he believed, and weakness was something he couldn't afford. Instead, he decided to retreat. A week after the gala, Victor boarded his private jet, bound for a secluded island he owned halfway across the globe. It was meant to be a luxurious escape, a place where he could wait out the storm until public outrage died down. But as the plane soared higher into the sky, Victor had no idea that fate had other plans for him. Plans that would force him to confront not only the consequences of his actions but also the darkest corners of his own soul. Little did he know, this journey would lead him to face the very people he despised, and ultimately, to discover a truth about himself that he never expected. Victor Langley's private jet soared above the clouds, a sleek silver bird carrying him far away from the chaos he had left behind. He sipped champagne as he gazed out the window, watching the endless expanse of blue sky stretch into infinity. For now, he was safe from critics, protesters, and the incessant noise of people who didn't understand him. His island retreat awaited him, a paradise untouched by the ugliness of the world. Or so he thought. The flight crew moved quietly around the cabin, ensuring Victor's comfort. They knew better than to disturb him unless absolutely necessary. His mood was unpredictable at best. But as the hours passed, something unusual began to happen. The plane hit pockets of turbulence, jolting slightly before stabilizing again. At first, no one paid much attention. It was common for flights over oceans to encounter rough patches. However, the turbulence grew worse with each passing minute. The once smooth ride became erratic, shaking violently enough to rattle the glasses on the tray tables. Victor frowned, gripping the armrests of his seat. He hated disruptions, especially when they interfered with his plans. "What's going on?" he barked at the nearest flight attendant, a young woman whose name he couldn't remember. "Just some turbulence, sir," she replied nervously, forcing a smile. Nothing to worry about. But her reassurance did little to calm him. As the plane shuddered again, this time more violently than before, panic began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged worried glances, clutching their seats or loved ones tightly. Over the intercom, the pilot's voice crackled, attempting to sound reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some unexpected weather conditions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We'll have everything under control shortly." Victor snorted dismissively. Control? He'd spent his entire life maintaining control, bending situations and people to his will. This was different. It was chaos, randomness, the kind of thing he despised most. And it scared him. Suddenly, the plane lurched downward, throwing everyone inside into a state of sheer terror. Screams filled the air as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Victor fumbled to secure his mask, his hands trembling despite his attempts to appear composed. Outside the windows, lightning illuminated dark storm clouds that seemed to swallow the aircraft whole. The engines roared unnaturally loud, straining against forces beyond their design. Then came the deafening sound of metal groaning under pressure, followed by an explosion that sent the plane spiraling toward the ocean below. Time slowed to a crawl. Victor felt weightless as gravity pulled him downward, the screams of other passengers fading into a distant hum. His mind raced with fragmented thoughts. Was this how it ended? After all he'd achieved? After building an empire meant to last forever? Was he really going to die like this? Fear gripped him like never before, paralyzing him completely. And then impact. The crash was catastrophic. The plane broke apart upon hitting the water, sending debris scattering across miles of open sea. Miraculously, Victor survived, though barely. Dazed and injured, he floated among the wreckage, clinging to a piece of the fuselage as waves crashed around him. Hours passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion, until finally, he washed ashore on a remote, uninhabited island. When Victor opened his eyes, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sandy beach. His body ached and his clothes were soaked, but he was alive. Slowly he sat up, scanning his surroundings. The island was small, covered in dense jungle and surrounded by endless ocean. There was no sign of civilization anywhere. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm him. How could this be happening? He was Victor Langley, billionaire extraordinaire. People didn't just abandon him to die. Then he heard voices, weak and hoarse. They called out faintly from somewhere nearby. Dragging himself to his feet, Victor stumbled toward the sound. Through the trees, he spotted two figures lying on the sand, both battered but alive. One was a tall man with dark skin and muscular arms, while the other was shorter, with olive-toned skin and a wiry frame. Both looked exhausted, their faces streaked with dirt and salt water. "Who are you?" Victor demanded, his tone sharp even in his weakened state. The taller man blinked, squinting up at him. "Jamal," he croaked, "and this is Carlos." Victor frowned, recognizing their names vaguely from the passenger manifest. Jamal was a construction worker from Detroit, traveling home after completing a job overseas. Carlos was a chef originally from Mexico, heading back to New York City where he worked at a popular restaurant. Neither man fit into Victor's narrow definition of success. They were laborers, immigrants, exactly the kind of people he detested. Yet here they were, the only other survivors of the crash. For the next few days, survival became their sole focus. With no supplies and limited resources, the trio had to rely on each other to stay alive. Jamal proved invaluable, using his knowledge of wilderness survival to build a makeshift shelter from palm leaves and driftwood. He showed them how to start a fire using dry twigs and friction, keeping predators at bay during the night. Carlos, meanwhile, used his creativity to improvise tools for fishing and gathering food. Using sharpened sticks and scraps of metal from the wreckage, he managed to catch fish from the shallow waters near the shore. Victor, however, contributed little. Used to having others do everything for him, he struggled to adapt to the harsh realities of their situation. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, and dehydration left him weak and irritable. Instead of pitching in, he criticized Jamal and Carlos constantly, complaining about the quality of the shelter or the lack of proper food. "This isn't good enough," he snapped one evening as they huddled around the fire. "Surely you can do better than this?" Jamal shot him a look, his patience wearing thin. "If you've got a problem, why don't you try doing something yourself instead of sitting there whining?" Carlos nodded in agreement. "Yeah, man. We're all stuck here together. If you want things to improve, help us out." Victor bristled at their audacity. How dare they talk to him like that? Didn't they know who he was? But pride kept him from arguing further. Reluctantly, he began assisting with simple tasks, fetching water from a nearby stream or collecting firewood. It was humiliating work, far beneath someone of his status, but he had no choice. Without Jamal and Carlos, he wouldn't survive. Despite his grudging cooperation, Victor's attitude remained toxic. He treated the two men like servants rather than equals, barking orders and expecting immediate obedience. Jamal and Carlos tolerated it at first, focusing on the bigger picture, staying alive, but frustration simmered beneath the surface. They weren't blind to Victor's prejudices, the way he looked down on them simply because of who they were. It grated on them, adding tension to an already difficult situation. One particularly scorching afternoon, tensions boiled over. Victor had been complaining nonstop about the heat and mosquitoes, blaming Jamal and Carlos for not finding a better place to set up camp. When Carlos suggested moving deeper into the jungle to find shade, Victor scoffed. "Are you kidding me? Do you even know what you're doing? You'll probably get us lost." That was the final straw. Carlos stood up, his face flushed with anger. "Listen, buddy," he said, stepping closer to Victor. "We're the reason you're still breathing right now. If it weren't for us, you'd be dead. So show some respect, okay?" Jamal joined, in his deep voice cutting through the humid air. "He's right, we've been busting our asses to keep you alive while you sit there acting like you're too good for us. Newsflash, man, you're not. Out here, we're all the same." Victor stared at them, stunned. No one had ever spoken to him like that before. In his world, people bowed to his authority, fearful of crossing him. Yet here were these two men, standing up to him without hesitation. For the first time in his life, Victor felt powerless, and it terrified him. As the days turned into weeks, the struggle for survival forced Victor to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Watching Jamal and Carlos work tirelessly, risking their lives to ensure his safety, made him question everything he believed. Why did he hate people like them so much? What had they ever done to deserve his contempt? Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his hardened exterior began to crack. Beneath the layers of arrogance and prejudice lay a man desperate to understand, not just the world around him, but also the darkness within himself. Unbeknownst to Victor, this transformation was only beginning. The island was testing him in ways he could never have imagined, pushing him to his limits physically, emotionally, and morally. And though he didn't realize it yet, the lessons he would learn here would change him forever. Lessons that could only come from being saved by the very men he once despised. As the weeks dragged on, life on the island became a daily battle against nature and against Victor's own stubbornness. The trio had settled into a routine of sorts, though it was far from harmonious. Jamal and Carlos worked tirelessly to keep them alive, while Victor continued to resist fully participating. He still complained about everything, the heat, the food, the mosquitoes, but his complaints grew quieter, less biting. Something inside him was shifting, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Jamal noticed the change first. Despite Victor's constant grumbling, he'd started doing small tasks without being asked. He fetched water in the mornings, helped gather firewood, and even attempted to fish alongside Carlos one afternoon. It wasn't much, but it was progress. "He's starting to come around," Jamal said to Carlos one evening as they sat by the fire, watching Victor clumsily try to gut a fish. Carlos shrugged, poking at the flames with a stick. "Maybe, but don't hold your breath. A leopard doesn't change its spots overnight." Jamal chuckled. "True. Still, I think there's more to him than we thought. Maybe this place is making him see things differently." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Or maybe he's just scared. Out here, he can't rely on money or power to get what he wants. That's gotta mess with his head." They both fell silent, glancing over at Victor, who was now cursing under his breath after dropping the fish back into the sand. For all his flaws, he looked almost human, vulnerable even. It was strange seeing someone so arrogant brought down to their level. One night, as the three of them huddled around the fire, a storm rolled in unexpectedly. Dark clouds gathered overhead, blocking out the stars, and the wind began to howl through the trees. Within minutes, rain poured down in sheets, drenching everything in sight. Their shelter, hastily built from palm leaves and driftwood, offered little protection. Water seeped through the cracks, soaking their clothes and extinguishing the fire. "We need to reinforce the shelter," Jamal shouted over the roar of the storm. "If we don't, it'll collapse." Victor hesitated, staring at the flimsy structure. "Reinforce it with what? We don't have any tools." "That's not gonna stop us," Jamal replied firmly. We use whatever we've got. Come on, grab that piece of wood over there. Once, Victor didn't argue. He scrambled to help, holding pieces of debris in place while Jamal and Carlos worked to secure the roof. The rain stung their skin, and the wind threatened to knock them off their feet, but they pressed on. By the time the worst of the storm passed, the shelter was still standing. Barely. Exhausted, the three collapsed onto the damp ground, catching their breath. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Carlos broke the silence. Not bad for a billionaire, he teased, nodding toward Victor. Victor smirked despite himself. Don't get used to it, I'm only helping because I don't want to sleep in the mud. But his tone lacked its usual venom. There was something lighter about him now, as if the storm had washed away some of his bitterness. Jamal and Carlos exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging the subtle shift. Over the next few days, Victor continued to chip away at his defenses. One morning, while Jamal and Carlos were out gathering coconuts, he decided to attempt building a better fishing spear. Using scraps of metal from the plane wreckage and a sharp rock, he fashioned a crude tool. It wasn't perfect, but it was functional. When Jamal and Carlos returned, they found him wading knee-deep in the shallows, jabbing at fish with surprising determination. Look who's trying to be handy, Carlos remarked, smirking. Victor glanced up, scowling. I'm just tired of eating raw fish every day. Thought I'd contribute for once. Jamal grinned. Well, good job. Maybe you're not completely useless after all. Victor rolled his eyes, but there was no real malice behind it. For the first time since the crash, he felt a flicker of pride. Not the kind that came from wealth or power, but from actually doing something worthwhile. It was a foreign feeling, one he wasn't sure how to process yet. The turning point came during a quiet evening when the three men sat around the fire, sharing stories to pass the time. Jamal talked about growing up in Detroit, describing the challenges of working multiple jobs to put himself through college. His voice softened as he spoke about his mother, a single parent who had sacrificed everything to give him a better life. She always told me that hard work pays off, he said. And yeah, it does. But sometimes, no matter how hard you work, the world still tries to hold you back. Carlos nodded, chiming in with his own story. He spoke about crossing the border, illegally as a teenager, leaving behind his family in Mexico to chase dreams of becoming a chef. It wasn't easy, he admitted. I worked long hours for low pay, sleeping on couches and skipping meals just to save enough money to send home. But I never gave up. My parents taught me to fight for what I believe in, no matter how tough things get. Victor listened quietly, his expression unreadable. He'd never heard stories like these before. Or rather, he'd chosen not to listen. In his world, people like Jamal and Carlos were statistics, faceless figures he dismissed as lazy or undeserving. But sitting there, hearing their struggles and triumphs firsthand, he realized how wrong he'd been. These weren't criminals or freeloaders. They were fighters, survivors, just like him. When it was his turn to speak, Victor hesitated. He wasn't used to opening up, especially not to people he'd once considered beneath him. But something inside him urged him to try. I guess I owe you guys an apology, he began awkwardly, avoiding their eyes. I've treated you like crap since we got here. Honestly, I've treated most people like crap my whole life. I thought, I don't know, that I was better than everyone else because I had money and success. But now I see how stupid that is. You two have done more for me in the past few weeks than anyone else ever has. The words hung in the air, heavy with honesty. Jamal and Carlos stared at him, stunned. They hadn't expected an apology, let alone one so sincere. Finally, Jamal spoke. It takes guts to admit when you're wrong. Not many people would do that. Carlos nodded. Yeah, man. We're not saying we forgive you completely, we've still got trust issues. But this is a start. Victor managed a small smile. Thanks. I'll take it. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between the three men grew stronger. They began working together more seamlessly, relying on each other's strengths to overcome challenges. Jamal's resourcefulness, Carlos's creativity and even Victor's newfound willingness to contribute created a sense of teamwork that none of them had experienced before. But the island wasn't done testing them yet. One afternoon, while exploring the jungle in search of fresh water, they stumbled upon something unexpected: a group of smugglers operating a makeshift camp deep in the woods. The men were armed and clearly dangerous, their faces hardened by years of living outside the law. Jamal, Carlos, and Victor froze, hidden behind a cluster of bushes, as they watched the smugglers load crates onto a small boat anchored nearby. "Wait. Need to leave. Now," Jamal whispered urgently. Victor nodded, already backing away. But as they turned to retreat, a twig snapped beneath Victor's foot. The sound echoed through the quiet forest, drawing the attention of the smugglers. Before they could react, shouts erupted and several men emerged from the camp, weapons drawn. "Who's there?" one of them barked, scanning the area. Jamal grabbed Victor's arm, pulling him deeper into the bushes. "Stay low and don't move," he hissed. For once, Victor obeyed without question. Heart pounding, he crouched beside Jamal and Carlos, praying the smugglers wouldn't find them. But luck wasn't on their side. Moments later, a pair of rough hands yanked Victor to his feet, dragging him into the open. Jamal and Carlos followed reluctantly, knowing resistance would only make things worse. The smugglers tied them up and interrogated them harshly, demanding to know why they were trespassing. Victor tried to explain that they were stranded survivors, but the leader, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, didn't believe him. "You expect me to buy that? 3 rich tourists wandering around my territory? Bullshit." Fear gripped Victor as he realized the gravity of their situation. These men weren't going to let them go easily. Desperation surged within him, and for the first time in his life, he made a choice that shocked even himself. "It's my fault," Victor blurted out, stepping forward despite his restraints. "I led us here. If you want someone to blame, take me." Jamal and Carlos stared at him, stunned. Never in a million years would they have expected Victor to sacrifice himself for them. Moved by his courage, they joined forces to fight back. Using their combined skills, they managed to overpower the smugglers and escape. By the time they reached safety, Victor knew he was no longer the same man who had stepped off that private jet. The island had stripped him of his arrogance, forcing him to confront his prejudices and rediscover his humanity. And though their ordeal was far from over, he finally understood what it meant to truly value another person, not for their wealth or status, but for who they were. The escape from the smugglers was nothing short of miraculous. With their hands bound and fear gripping their hearts, Jamal, Carlos, and Victor had managed to turn the tables on their captors through sheer determination and teamwork. It wasn't planned, it couldn't have been, but desperation made them resourceful. When the smugglers' leader turned his back for a brief moment, Victor seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, using his shoulder to knock the man off balance. The move caught everyone by surprise, including Victor himself. For years, he'd relied on others to handle physical confrontations. Violence was beneath someone like him, or so he'd always believed. But now, with survival at stake, instincts took over. His sudden action gave Jamal and Carlos the opening they needed. Jamal, who had spent years working construction, used his strength to wrestle a rifle away from one of the guards. Carlos, quick on his feet, grabbed a fallen branch and swung it like a bat, striking another smuggler squarely in the jaw. Chaos erupted as the trio fought back with everything they had. Punches were thrown, shouts filled the air, and within minutes, the smugglers were either unconscious or fleeing into the jungle. Breathing heavily, the 3 men stood amidst the wreckage of the camp, their bodies bruised but alive. Blood trickled down Victor's temple where he'd been grazed by a bullet, but he barely noticed. Adrenaline coursed through him, leaving little room for pain. For the first time in his life, Victor felt something he never thought possible. Pride, not in wealth or power, but in courage and unity. "That was insane," Carlos said, breaking the silence. His voice trembled slightly, betraying the mix of fear and exhilaration coursing through him. "Did we really just do that?" Jamal nodded, clutching the rifle tightly. Yeah, we did, and we're still standing. Let's not waste this chance. Victor looked at them both, his chest rising and falling rapidly. You saved me, he said quietly. Again. Carlos smirked, though there was no malice in it. Don't get used to it, rich guy. Next time you're on your own. Despite the joke, the tension between them had softened. Victor's selfless act during the confrontation hadn't gone unnoticed. By stepping forward to take the blame, he'd proven that he was willing to risk his life for people he once despised. It was a turning point, not just for Victor, but for the group as a whole. With the smugglers defeated, the trio wasted no time putting distance between themselves and the camp. They moved quickly through the dense jungle, careful to avoid leaving tracks that might lead their enemies back to them. Every step was painful. Bruises throbbed, cuts stung, and exhaustion weighed heavily on their limbs. But they pressed on, without complaint. Survival depended on it. As night fell, they found shelter under a cluster of large rocks, huddling together for warmth. The storm from days earlier had left the air damp and chilly, and none of them had proper clothing to protect against the elements. Victor, once accustomed to silk sheets and climate-controlled rooms, wrapped himself in a tattered piece of fabric salvaged from the wreckage. He didn't complain, though. Not this time. Sitting close to the makeshift fire Jamal had managed to ignite, Victor reflected on what had happened. He'd always seen himself as untouchable, immune to the struggles faced by ordinary people. But here he was, battered and broken, relying on two men he'd once dismissed as inferior. The irony wasn't lost on him. If anything, it humbled him further. "Why did you do it?" Jamal asked suddenly, breaking the quiet. His tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. Victor glanced at him, then at Carlos. "Do what?" "Step forward." "Like that," Jamal clarified. "You could have stayed quiet, let us deal with it. Instead, you put yourself in harm's way. Why?" Victor hesitated, searching for the right words. Because I owed you. Both of you. You've done so much for me since we crashed here, and all I've done is insult you, treat you like garbage. When those guys came after us, I realized I couldn't keep being that person, not anymore." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying you've changed? Just like that?" "No," Victor admitted. "Not completely, but I'm trying. I don't expect you to trust me overnight. I wouldn't trust me either. But I want to be better. For myself, and for people like you." The honesty in his voice struck a chord. Jamal and Carlos exchanged glances, silently communicating. Finally, Jamal spoke. "We'll see. Actions speak louder than words, Victor. Keep proving yourself, and maybe we'll believe you." Victor nodded, accepting the challenge. Deep down, he knew trust couldn't be earned overnight, but for the first time in his life, he was willing to work for it. Over the next few days, the trio focused on staying hidden while continuing their search for rescue. They scavenged what little food they could find, rationed their dwindling water supply, and kept watch for any signs of danger. The island was vast, its terrain unforgiving, but they refused to give up hope. Each sunrise brought renewed determination, each sunset a reminder of how far they'd come. One morning, as they climbed a hill overlooking the ocean, they spotted something that made their hearts race, a ship in the distance. Its silhouette was faint against the horizon, but unmistakable. Without hesitation, they gathered whatever materials they could find and built a signal fire on the beach below. Smoke billowed into the sky, dark and thick, visible for miles. Hours passed as they waited anxiously, scanning the waters for any sign of movement. Just when despair began to creep in, the ship changed course, heading straight toward them. Cheers erupted as they realized they'd finally been spotted. Tears streamed down Carlos's face as he hugged Jamal tightly. Even Victor allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. When the rescue team arrived, pulling them aboard the vessel, the relief was overwhelming. Clean clothes, fresh water, and medical attention awaited them. As they sailed away from the island, Victor looked back at the place that had tested him in ways he never imagined. It had stripped him of his arrogance, forced him to confront his prejudices, and ultimately given him a second chance at redemption. Back in civilization, news of their survival spread quickly. Reporters swarmed the docks, eager to hear their story. Cameras flashed, microphones extended, and questions flew from every direction. But when asked about his experience, Victor surprised everyone, including himself. "I learned a lot out there," he said, addressing the crowd. "About survival, yes, but also about humanity. I went into that jungle thinking I was better than everyone else. What I found instead were two men who taught me what it means to truly live. Jamal and Carlos saved my life, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. They showed me that no amount of money or power can replace kindness, humility, and respect." His words resonated deeply, earning applause from the gathered crowd. Jamal and Carlos stood beside him, smiling proudly. Though their journey had been fraught with challenges, it had forged a bond stronger than any material wealth. For Victor, the hardest part was yet to come. Returning to his old life meant facing the consequences of his past actions, and proving that his transformation was genuine. But for the first time, he felt ready to take on the world, not as a billionaire tycoon, but as a man determined to make amends. Little did he know, the lessons he'd learned on that remote island would shape the rest of his life. When Victor Langley stepped off the rescue ship and onto solid ground, he knew his life would never be the same. The cameras flashing in his face, the reporters shouting questions, and the crowd of onlookers waiting to catch a glimpse of the billionaire survivor. It all felt surreal. For years, Victor had thrived in the spotlight, basking in the admiration of others. But now, standing there with Jamal and Carlos by his side, he realized how empty that attention had always been. Fame without purpose meant nothing. What mattered was the connection he'd forged with these two men, and the lessons they'd taught him about humanity. The media circus surrounding their rescue dominated headlines for weeks. Photos of the trio graced magazine covers, accompanied by dramatic retellings of their harrowing ordeal. Some stories focused on the crash itself, detailing how Victor's private jet had plummeted into the ocean. Others highlighted the daring escape from the smugglers, painting Victor as a hero who had risked his life to protect his companions. While some praised his bravery, others remained skeptical, accusing him of staging a publicity stunt to repair his tarnished reputation. Victor didn't care what the critics said. He knew the truth, and so did Jamal and Carlos. The real victory wasn't in surviving the island, it was in becoming a better version of himself. For the first time in his life, Victor refused to play the role society expected of him. Instead of hiding behind wealth or power, he embraced vulnerability, openly admitting his past mistakes and vowing to change. In the weeks following their rescue, Victor threw himself into making amends. He began by apologizing publicly, not just for the racist comment at the gala, but for years of prejudice and cruelty. During an emotional interview on national television, he spoke candidly about his journey, sharing how Jamal and Carlos had saved him not only physically, but also emotionally. "I spent my life hating people I didn't understand," he confessed. "But it took being stranded on an island with the very men I despised to realize we're all the same. We all bleed red." His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations across the country about privilege, bias, and redemption. Many dismissed his apology as insincere, claiming he was simply trying to save face. But those closest to him, Jamal, Carlos, and a small circle of trusted friends, knew better. They saw the sincerity in his eyes, the humility in his actions. Victor wasn't seeking forgiveness, he was seeking growth. To prove his commitment, Victor made drastic changes to his lifestyle. He sold off parts of his empire, donating millions to organizations supporting minority communities and immigrant rights. Companies he once used as tools for profit became vehicles for positive change, hiring diverse workforces and funding affordable housing projects. Even his foundation, once criticized for doing little actual good, transformed into a beacon of hope, providing scholarships and resources to underprivileged youth. But perhaps the most significant change came in his personal relationships. Victor hired Jamal and Carlos to lead major initiatives within his company, giving them opportunities they never thought possible. Jamal spearheaded a program to train workers in sustainable construction practices, while Carlos opened a chain of restaurants aimed at employing marginalized individuals. Together, they turned Victor's business empire into something meaningful, a force for good rather than greed. As months passed, Victor's transformation continued to inspire those around him. Former employees who had once feared him now approached him with respect and admiration. Protesters who had marched outside his headquarters began volunteering for the causes he supported. Even his family, estranged for years due to his arrogance, reached out to reconcile. Slowly but surely, Victor rebuilt bridges he had burned long ago. One evening, as he sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, Victor reflected on how far he'd come. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioner, a stark contrast to the chaos of the island. On his desk lay a framed photo of him, Jamal, and Carlos standing together after their rescue. Their smiles were genuine, their bond unbreakable. That picture served as a constant reminder of the man he used to be, and the man he was striving to become. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Jamal, holding a folder filled with reports on the latest project updates. "Got a minute?" he asked, stepping inside. Victor nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "Always, what's up?" Jamal handed over the folder, explaining the progress they'd made in expanding the scholarship program. As they discussed the details, Victor couldn't help but smile. Here he was, sitting side by side with someone he'd once considered beneath him, collaborating as equals. It was a testament to how much he'd changed and how much further he still had to go. After Jamal left, Victor picked up the framed photo again, studying it closely. He thought about the stormy night when they'd nearly lost their shelter, the day they fought off the smugglers, and the countless moments in between that had shaped him. Those experiences had stripped away his ego, forcing him to confront the ugliness within himself. And though the process had been painful, it had also been liberating. Months later, Victor stood on stage at a charity gala, addressing a room full of influential figures. Gone was the smug billionaire who had insulted Marcus Johnson all those months ago. In his place stood a humble man, determined to use his platform for good. As he spoke about the importance of equality and compassion, the audience listened intently, moved by his sincerity. "I'm not here to tell you I've got all the answers," Victor said, his voice steady. "I'm still learning, still growing, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. The difference lies in whether we choose to learn from them or let them define us." Applause erupted throughout the hall, echoing like waves, crashing against the shore. Victor scanned the crowd, locking eyes with Jamal and Carlos, who stood near the back, smiling proudly. They had been his teachers, his saviors, and now, his friends. As he stepped off the stage, Victor felt a sense of peace he hadn't known before. His journey wasn't over. He knew there would always be more work to do, but for the first time he felt hopeful. Hopeful that he could continue to grow, to heal, and to make a difference. Hopeful that the man he had become was someone worth knowing. And as he walked out of the gala, surrounded by people who believed in him, Victor Langley finally understood what it meant to truly live.